I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Mary Eberstadt is one of America's foremost public intellectuals. She's a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute, but that just begins to touch the surface of her accomplishments. She's also the author of an important new book, Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Mary Eberstadt recently spoke with the Colson Center's John Stonestreet about the book and about identity politics, the sexual revolution, as well as religious liberty.
Well, welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I'm really excited about this conversation. Sometimes you come across a book or an essay that puts things together in a particularly important way. And as we've all kind of watched what seems to be mental breakdowns on college campuses and this headlines and things that happen in media, they've all been traced back to this thing called identity politics. My guest today is Dr. Mary Eberstadt, and she has written an extremely important book called Primal Screams, in which she is making a connection between identity politics and the sexual revolution. Mary Eberstadt is an American writer, senior fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. You can visit her website, maryeberstadt.com, and her bio is just one of those incredible bios. In fact, I want you to hear what Dr. Robert George has said about Mary Eberstadt. He said, "It's scarcely a foregone conclusion that our society will return to sanity on questions of sexual morality and marriage. But if we do, prophets like Mary Eberstadt will be celebrated in song and story." I got to tell you, Mary, I've never had anyone say that I will ever be celebrated in song and story. That's a pretty cool endorsement.
Thank you, John.
But I want to say thanks for taking the time to be a part of this conversation today on the BreakPoint podcast.
It's a pleasure.
So you're making a connection between identity politics and the sexual revolution, and there's so many chapters of this I think that we need to visit. And I found so many parts of this book just really fascinating, discussions of popular culture, discussions of history, discussions of abandonment that I just think are really important things. But I think it's important to start by defining the term identity politics, because that's thrown around a lot in a pejorative sense very often. And what do we mean by identity politics?
Well, what listeners need to understand, John, is that identity politics is actually a very new way of doing politics. People have always joined groups to further their political interests, but identity politics begins in 1977 with a document that was put out by radical African-American feminists. And essentially they said, we give up on anybody else in the world having our back and supporting us, which is already a very important statement. And This is where identity politics comes from. It comes from a feeling of grievance, a feeling as if no one out there has your back except for the group that you identify with. And once you're in one of these identity groups, furthermore, the idea is you can't understand me if you're not on the inside with me. So this is a very new phenomenon. It's very emotionally raw, and I wrote the book to try and understand what's driving it.
Well, it seems like it's gotten an awful lot of academic credibility. Well, I don't know, academic credibility is the right term. Credibility on university campuses, the whole concept that this is a legitimate way to divide people up. This is a legitimate way to see people's deepest identity as simply, almost characteristics that we share by accidents of nature, unless you believe in God, and then it's the sovereignty of God. Where's the credibility coming from?
I think what's happened is that our society has become unmoored from traditional ways of answering the question, who am I? So, for example, you alluded to religion. To religious people, my identity is obvious. I'm a child of God, right? That's what's important about me. I'm a child of God, not my skin color, not my other accidental characteristics. But in a secularizing world, a lot of people can't answer the question, who am I, with reference to their religion. Similarly, the other way we typically answer that question is by reference to our role in a familial order, right? Who am I? I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, I'm a wife. But after the sexual revolution, this way of answering the question also became more complicated. Is that my sister over there? Well, it depends. If she's my stepfather's daughter and our parents have divorced, is she still my sister? all of these questions that affect fundamental notions of identity come into play after the sexual revolution. And my book argues that this is what's driving people into these collective political identities. You can see how frantic they are to find some way of answering that question, who am I? And that franticness is coming about, I think, because the traditional ways of answering that question have become harder and in some cases out of reach altogether for many people.
So, I have wrestled for several years with kind of the loss of identity in philosophical terms. In other words, and you mentioned this, I think this would kind of go to the loss of religion. A secularizing culture has lost any kind of ideological categories or philosophical categories to really answer that question, who am I? What I really appreciated about Primal Screams, Mary, is how you kind of pointed to kind of the tangible losses in culture. In other words, people who have never, kind of wrestled with how philosophically the world has changed. I think Rod Dreher called it a cosmological shift in one of his articles years ago. Most people don't think that deeply. They've never read Derrida or Foucault. They haven't wrestled, with any of the kind of the great philosophical treatises on the question of identity. This is just kind of a loss in culture of these tangible institutions and artifacts that used to give us a sense of stability. And I think is kind of what you're saying, that we've kind of underestimated how cosmic that sort of loss of those things are.
Yes, absolutely, John. And the result of underestimating that loss is that there is suffering that we are documenting in social science and elsewhere that's springing all from the same foundation, new forms of suffering. So in the book, I get into, for example, the explosion of loneliness studies among the elderly in every advanced country of the world. Now, why is there an epidemic of loneliness among old people? Because these are people who came of age during the sexual revolution. Many didn't marry, many had no children if they did marry. And so here we have a clear-cut case that links the sexual revolution to a really serious development, which is loneliness epidemics. And there are other examples one can point to. Why is it that for years psychiatric problems have been rising among the young? This is something that 15 years ago was controversial. People thought, no, it's just that we're better at diagnosing these things. But now experts agree that both anxiety and depression are rising among young people and have been for years. Again, I don't think it's hard to connect the dots between the truncated family lives that are typical today and these kinds of outcomes. So yes, I agree with Rod and with you. This is a cosmological shift. Something has happened. We've got a self-inflicted wound of an order that we never expected to have. And I wrote the book to hold that suffering up in the hopes that it might change some hearts and minds.
I think that's one of the stunning things about it. We talked about the loneliness epidemic of the elderly. I mean, that's just not a theoretical concept. You gave hard, fast numbers. I mean, this is real people. It's easy to kind of think about that in abstract terms, but you talked about the heat wave across Europe last year, what we see in Japan, where bodies are discovered weeks later because of the smell. I mean, and this isn't like a rare, maybe it's not an everyday occurrence, but it's not a rare occurrence. This seems like obvious tragedy.
Well, the New York Times estimated 2 years ago that there were 4,000 lonely deaths in Japan every week. So yes, that's certainly a tragedy. The point is to try and do something about it, to understand the damage that's out there. It's very countercultural to try and grasp this argument because the dominant narrative of our time is that the sexual revolution brought all of these goods to humanity. It liberated us from the chains of fertility. But my point, John, is that if we really look at the kind of animals we are, and we are animals, after all, we're at least in part animals, we are social animals. Human beings are not meant to live in this atomized way that so many of us live now, without siblings, without cousins, without extended family. All of these building blocks of the family have been important to becoming the kind of beings that human beings are. And without those building blocks, we're stumbling.
I think the sexual revolution, though, is kind of, sold as a promise of freedom, and we're just now coming to terms. And it's amazing how hard-headed we are to come to terms with the great losses. And that was part of your, I think, second chapter, A New Theory, where you talk about how many things, and you use the phrase gone, gone siblings, gone parents. And I want you to walk us through those, because again, in the abstract, the sexual revolution is on the left, it's about freedom. It's about getting rid of old, archaic ideas about sex and so on. On the right, the sexual revolution is often just kind of chalked up as a moral shift, we just changed our minds on what's right and wrong. But what you're pointing to is how many things have disappeared from so many people's lives, because of this. In other words, it's a whole lot more than ideas. Walk us through all the things that are disappearing.
Well, I'm just pointing to demographic trends, to empirical evidence. So the sexual revolution gave rise to a number of behaviors that were previously stigmatized or rare. So these would include fatherless homes, for example, abortion on a massive scale, broken families, shrinking families, which I think is very important. The size of the American family has been radically reduced. When you put all of these phenomena together, let's leave aside the moral content of any of them. Every one of those things amounts to reducing the number of people in the lives of individuals who are family members. It's reducing the number of people who can be expected to have your back. So, in effect, it's a problem in arithmetic. It's a problem of subtraction. That is what no one saw coming about the sexual revolution, that it would radically reduce the familial community of people in such a way that harm could be forthcoming from it. And that's what I'm trying to get at in the book.
I remember specifically talking about siblings, and that's something that I think, again, most of us would miss. I didn't have a brother or sister. I wish I would have. Or even the justification of parents. I only want one child because I'm gonna raise this one right, and I'm not sure I can raise two right. You spend a lot of time in the book, in this chapter, talking about kind of the lost siblings and the impact that has. Would you walk us through that just for a bit?
Sure. Well, I'm drawing in part from a lot of new research into animal behavior that shows that other animals learn from their siblings and their parents. And learning from siblings is very important in the animal kingdom. And by extension, I think the same is true in the human kingdom. For example, siblings of the opposite sex are the first place where a lot of us learn about the opposite sex. So what happens in a world where we don't have that way of learning anymore? Well, in addition to raising the risks of loneliness, say, a world with fewer family members in it is also a world in which we have fewer people to learn from. And I think that's terribly important. I think we see that play out, John, in the #MeToo movement, where it becomes clear that for a great many people, the knowledge of the opposite sex, that is non-sexual knowledge of the opposite sex, seems to be declining because you get these stories that are completely at odds with one another. You have women going to their bosses' hotel rooms at night and not understanding that something bad could happen from that. So in that particular chapter, I get into what I think is the biggest breakdown of social learning of all, which is relations between the sexes. And again, I think this is coming from the fact that we are not learning, many of us are not learning from an early age about the opposite sex in the safe context of the family.
Right, but we are learning from other sources, and so many of those sources are hypersexualized, whether it's, sitcoms and movies and music and pornography, right?
Yeah, and those are poor substitutes for learning, again, in the safe context of family life. Instead, we have all of these other competing narratives, which paint unhealthy, in some cases dangerous, pictures of what life with the opposite sex is like. So, yes, there's a search on for substitutes, but just as identity politics is no substitute for the real family, so are these other narratives no substitute for learning about the opposite sex in the context of the family.
I want to go to something else that is in the book, and it's based on an earlier article that you had written, an earlier essay, I guess is a more accurate way to say it, having to do with kind of the pop culture angst of the 90s. And you talk about how there are these indications that the breakdown of the family is something that is harming young people. And we know this from the music of Eminem or the music of Kurt Cobain. You know, kind of the classic 90s when everything is going right in the world, right? I mean, it's after the Cold War, before the War on Terror. You know, it's a time of economic prosperity, all that sort of stuff. And all the music coming out is talking about, you know, where's my dad? I hate myself. You know, I don't have a family. You mentioned even Papa Roach, you know, which had a song about suicide with one of the most haunting music videos. I tell you what it made me think of, Mary, is oftentimes when I talk about, you know, in a public talk that I give on how culture has changed in its understanding of marriage, I compare the 80s and the 90s. The number one show of the 80s was The Cosby Show. Now, that's a loaded reference today, but you could also point to Full House, and you could also, you know, talk about Family Ties, which was the, you know, early 80s and all that sort of thing. But family was the center of television in the 80s. The 90s was Seinfeld and Friends, where the family has disappeared and life is great. And I often talk about how dramatic that shift is between the 80s and 90s in television. And I had never made the further connection to how at that same time in the 90s, our music is screaming to us, hey, the loss of family is hurting a lot of people. That's a remarkable insight, and I think it tells us a lot, doesn't it?
Well, it sure does. I mean, the distinction is between the music of abandon, which is what you get in the 1960s and 70s, and by the 90s, it's the music of abandonment. And I think it's a mostly undiscovered story, but as you know, in the book, I list the singers who make family breakup the centerpiece of their work. And this is nowhere as true as of Eminem, who rages on in song after song about what it was like not to have a father, what it was like to feel like his sibling was unprotected, etc. And Eminem is just at the top of the heap. This is the refrain of 1990s music, including in other rap. I give the example of Tupac Shakur, who had one of the saddest songs I've ever heard in my life. It's about a boy who has to play baseball by himself, boy trying to play catch by himself. So social science is one way of measuring the damage that has ensued over the last few decades, but it's not the only way. Popular culture abounds with signs like these.
I just thought, what a contrast between the television of the 90s and the music of the 90s. I don't know if you've thought about that, but the number one show of the 90s was Seinfeld, or it was Friends. The number two show was Seinfeld. Whenever family popped up in those shows, you know, it was ridiculed. It was the source of, you know, the problems that they faced. Very different than the 80s, right, where you went to dad to get the solution, and 90s dad was the problem. And the television shows, one after another, are saying, you know, this is the new way we do life. Life is fine. And the music is saying the exact opposite message. I had just never made that connection to the stark contrast between the television of the 90s and the music of the 90s.
Well, if you remember, John, there was an attempt to censor some of the rap lyrics, and there was a lot of attention given to how violent the language was. But what was missed in there was the message. The violence in this music is coming from a primal place. It's coming from the complaint that I don't know what it's like to have a family. And so, again, there is different evidence that we can point to, but the conclusion remains the same, which is that something about our newly atomized life, something about crushing the petri dish of the family, has resulted in bad outcomes emotionally, psychologically, and otherwise.
My guest today is Mary Eberstadt. She's the author of Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And what we've been talking about here is an awful lot about the sexual revolution and all the kind of social, the levels of social impact that it had. I want to get back to that connection with identity politics specifically. One of the things that you do is in the second half of the book is you directly talk about feminism and you directly talk about the #MeToo movement. And, look, those on the conservative side of the aisle I think are really quick to kind of dismiss feminism as, it's crazy, it's irrational in so many ways. You call feminism here survival strategy. In other words, it's almost like, tell me if this, I tried to put it in a sentence, see if this makes sense. The sexual revolution hijacked feminism and basically robbed it of any hope. It essentially sold feminism a whole bunch of false promises. So kind of the second and third wave feminism that we see today has less to do about kind of a healthy respect for women and all that. And it itself has been victimized by the sexual revolution. Is that kind of what you're trying to say, or did I say that wrong?
Yes, no, that's right, John. And I don't think this point is well understood. I think feminism is a protective reaction to a world in which the sexual revolution has deprived many women of reliable male companionship. And I think that's where the anger in feminism comes from. Feminism says that its anger comes from the patriarchy, right? Or similar abstractions. But I don't think they understand the cause of their misery. When feminism started out, it looked like a happy thing. It was about burning your bras and liberating yourself from the household chains, etc. This is not the tone of feminism today. Feminism is aggressive. I give numerous examples in the book of the kind of coarse language that it deploys now. And my point is that in a world where it's become harder to find a husband, where maybe you didn't have a brother or a father or male cousins, where it's harder to have children, which even today most women say they want. Well, look, this is our world after the sexual revolution. All of these things have become more difficult. And in this world, I think feminism is a reaction, a kind of primal scream all its own at being deprived of these things, as many people are deprived of them now.
You also point to androgyny, and that hit home as well. I have 3 daughters that are 14, 12, and 10, and then we had a surprise little boy who's 2. So, that changes the world when a little boy enters your household. And, one of the things that we've been intentional with, or I've been intentional with, and I kind of wonder if I'm, losing my mind or overselling it or overzealous, but I make sure he has boy stuff, that he plays with boy stuff, that we talk a lot about what it means to be a boy and not a girl. And my daughters laugh at me, and I sat them down and I was like, look, when I was growing up, if a boy was confused about what a boy was and acted like a girl or like girl things, there were so many things in the culture to call him back to, no, this is a boy, that's girl stuff, this is boy stuff. And a lot of that was inappropriate. I mean, I'll even say some of that was overblown. But I look at the culture today, and this kind of push to androgyny is one of the things that leads me maybe to overreact. You can tell me if I'm overreacting or not, Mary, but I just think there's no other voice in our culture. I see so many waiters and baristas and flight attendants and businessmen and ministry partners where there's not a clear understanding of what it means to be a man. And I just kind of look and go, well, where else is he going to see this is normal boy stuff if he doesn't see it at home right now? What do you think? Am I overreacting? Maybe no, I'm a dad of a boy, and it bothers me that boys don't know what boys are.
No, you're not overreacting at all. So, again, I'd use an analogy from the animal world here. Imagine a lake that's downstream from a factory, and a lot of toxins have gotten dumped in the lake. Some fish are affected more than others for reasons that we'll never know. We'll never know why this fish and not that fish. But the point is, they share a collective environment that toxins have been dumped into. And I think this is very analogous to where we are, because right now, after the sexual revolution, the cultural incentives changed. For reasons that I get into in the book, they became much more likely to push men toward the feminine side and to push women toward the masculine side. Again, to cite the example of feminism, which is notably belligerent and aggressive, there we have an example of how, in the absence of male companionship, women will take on more masculine characteristics. And I think that's what's happened with feminism. What's happened with boys is something different. What's happened with boys, I think, is that in a world where half of all households are not going to have a biological father to learn from, the boy is left with learning from mom. Now, mom may be heroic. I think all single mothers are heroic. My own mother was single for some years. Mom may be heroic, but she is presenting a feminine model for how to behave. And again, we pick up on these kind of cues subliminally. We don't have to be conscious of these things. We're social animals. We pick up on cues just as if you start yawning, I might start yawning. We have a certain amount of copycat behavior that's built into us. And after the sexual revolution, more and more, what's happened is that both sexes are being pushed toward an androgynous mean.
Well, listen, we're out of time. I could go on and on. I just really thought this book was so helpful and so important. Again, the title is Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. If you come to BreakPoint.org and click there on the button on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, we'll link you to Mary's website and her author page on Amazon, and also how you can find this book. I did want to ask you one more question, though, which is one of the uniquenesses of this book as well is in the last half of the book, or the last part of the book, I guess, you actually invite responses from Rod Dreher, Mark Lilla, and Peter Thiel. And they're a mix. Rod supports your conclusions. I think Peter seemed a little bit more mixed, and Mark is probably doesn't agree with a lot of your conclusions. I just thought it was an interesting thing to do in a book, is to invite people to critique it. You know that's going to happen in literary journals and on websites, but you actually brought it into the book itself. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, that was a very deliberate move because we wanted the book to be a counterexample of argumentation that is counter to identity politics, because identity politics says you can't understand me unless you're in my group, whereas this book makes an argument that people can feel free to disagree with. That's why we had a social conservative, a liberal, and a libertarian commenting on it. And our hope is to set an example of what civility looks like among people who can agree to disagree. So that's why the commentary is in there, and I'm very happy that it is.
Well, I thought it was great, and I thought it was really interesting. You can certainly see the worldviews at work behind what they choose to point out, what they choose to highlight, where they disagree, and so on. And your response to their responses was full of grace. And again, I thought it's a great example. If that's what you were trying to accomplish, I think you did it, and you did it well. Well, my guest today has been Mary Eberstadt. She is the author of many books, but the one we've been talking about today is Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. I was captivated by the book. I thought it explained an awful lot, and I just couldn't recommend it enough. And Mary, was pleased that you agreed to come on and talk to me about it, just because I had questions based on the reading, and you've been super helpful. So thanks for writing the book, and thanks for joining us on the BreakPoint podcast.
Thank you for having me, John. It was a great pleasure.
That was Mary Eberstadt discussing religious liberty and its challenges with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. Before we go, I'd like to remind you that the Colson Center is offering a book this month that explores in more depth the issues John Stonestreet and Mary Eberstadt just discussed. Free to Believe is a powerful new book by Luke Goodrich, an attorney for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, where he's represented Hobby Lobby and Little Sisters of the Poor before the United States Supreme Court. You can get this new book by Luke Goodrich by going to breakpoint.org/book and making a donation of any size to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Again, that's breakpoint.org/book. Thanks for listening to today's BreakPoint podcast. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.